In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Church gets confusing sometimes, even for those who are leaders in it. And the gospel this morning comes in two parts, and you only heard the first half because of the way it's laid out in the book, although the whole thing is in your bulletin. But the great thing about Bible study is there's so much nuanced in there. And today we have chapters and verses, which were not in the original. The original in the Greek for the New Testament just simply ran on and on and on and on. And somebody like St. Jerome or some other monk somewhere thought, we need to divide this up someplace. And if you read it in the Greek, there's not even punctuation. There's no periods or commas or anything. You just kind of figure out where it breaks and stop there. But more than that, and it's kind of fun to say, why did they stop here and start there? But then even more fun sometimes is to figure out what was in the mind of the writer when he wrote these, when he put these stories in order. Because St. Matthew just didn't sit down with a group of stories that were going to A, B, C, D, and E. There was a method to his madness, I believe. And sometimes one story leads into another one, and one is illumined by another one. And I think we have that this morning. In the first story that Joe read, we hear that Jesus is having a debate with the Pharisees over kosher food. Why do you eat with defiled hands, or why do you eat unkosher food? And that's the debate Jesus is having. Maybe he's having a cheeseburger. Because you don't mix dairy and meat together. That's not kosher. That's not legal. Or maybe because he didn't wash his hands before he ate. And so the Sadducees and the Pharisees were very upset about that because he's stepping outside the ritual laws of Judaism. And they begin to think this is going to separate you from God. You're not doing it right. It's not the way it's done. So God's going to be upset with you. And so Jesus basically says to them, you guys aren't getting it. Because it's not what you eat that defiles a person. It's not what goes in, but what comes out. It's not what you eat that goes in and defiles you. It's what comes out of your mouth as far as your attitudes towards other people sometimes. What do we say to people or about people? And how often we tell people, it's not what you say sometimes, but how you say it. And so what comes out of our mouth sometimes is what betrays who and what we are. Now Jesus has just had this conversation with the Sadducees and the Pharisees. But now in part 2 of the gospel, you'll read that Jesus goes off to Tyre and Sidon, and he encounters a Canaanite woman. A heretic, a foreigner, non-Jew. Probably, most Jews thought she was going to hell in a handbasket. And this woman comes to Jesus and says, I want you to heal my daughter. And Jesus says to her, it's not fair to take the food off the table and throw it to the dogs. In the Koine Greek, that's not exactly what they're called. It was more colloquialism, but you get dog as the idea. And then I think Jesus stops a minute. And he thinks, what I've just done is what I was telling the Sadducees and the Pharisees not to do. And I really think that as much as I believe in the divinity of Jesus, I think he has his very human moments. And sometimes I think he learns from these moments. And I think when he encounters the Canaanite woman, and when he says to her what he says, he stops and realizes that's not right. That's not the way I should be talking to this woman. Now, you and I encounter Canaanite women and Canaanite men and all sorts of people all the time. And sometimes we say things about them. We may say things about their cultural heritage or their nationality or their preferences or where they live or their income and all these things. And sometimes we forget how much our words can hurt people. Sometimes we go looking for the negative side rather than the positive side. You know, the old thing your grandmother used to say, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all. Sometimes we forget that. Kind of like old Charlie. Charlie was a great old guy that always found something good to say about everybody. Everybody he knew, Charlie could find something good to say about him. So some of his friends plotted against Charlie once and said, we're going to pose him a thing where he can't find something good to say about somebody. So one afternoon over a cold beer, they asked Charlie, they said, you know, Charlie, you're always saying something good about everyone. And Charlie said, I try to find the good in everybody. And so his friend said, tell us, Charles, what can you find good to say about the devil? And Charlie thought a minute and he said, well, you got to admit he's a hard worker. We have to be careful what we say. Because I think at one point Jesus realized that once he had said this to this Canaanite woman, she realized the depth of faith that she had. And he finally heals her daughter. But I think what finally happens to Jesus, I think it colors the rest of his ministry. Because his next great thing, if you read on in Matthew, the next thing he does is feed the 5,000. So he's moving up. But he finally looks behind the curtain. He looks beyond the Canaaniteness of this woman. He looks inside and sees a child of God who is in need of love and affirmation and acceptance. He sees behind the screen and sees a woman inside who is coming to him in pain and sorrow because her only daughter is so sick. And Jesus finally says, just because she's a Canaanite, I cannot just, refuse to be part of what she wants and what she needs. And I think Jesus at that point realizes that's also part of his ministry. Not just to the people of Israel, but to the Canaanites as well. To look behind the curtain and see the person behind it. I think the message is very clear to us. We sometimes argue over, what goes into the mouth. We sometimes argue over the nooks and crannies of Christianity. We argue over where the line goes on the left or the right on the credence table. And in the sacristy this morning, we thought, hey, let's all show up in blue vestments today, see if anybody notices. But if we had, it would have been okay. God doesn't really care what color vestments we wear. That's something the church has come up with. What he's more concerned about is when we look behind the curtain of each other. And so when we encounter people, even if they're different from us, or they live different lives, or think different ways, or even have different religious beliefs, we have to look behind the curtain and see the person behind it who is reaching out and calling to us because they need what we've got. They need some affirmation. They need to realize somebody cares. They need to realize somebody knows they're alive. I think when we don't do that, then what comes out of our mouth defiles us. But if we look behind the curtain, if we see that person in need, if we see beyond the Canaanite woman to the child of God inside, then we will respond in a more appropriate way. So as Jesus says, it's not what goes in that defiles us, it's what comes out. And so we need to be careful about what comes out. We need sometimes to think before we speak, to think before we act, to realize that who we're talking to is a person with needs and feelings and who wants affirmation and love just as much as we do. And at that particular time and that particular place, we may be the only one doing that for them. It was interesting yesterday or the day before, I got an email from one of the people in the diocese who had been sort of at odds with one of the clergy around. And she said she finally got to work with this person over the weekend in a funeral setting. And she thought this priest had always been so aloof and set apart and condescending, but yet in this pastoral experience of a funeral, a very tragic funeral that went on in this church, she got to peek behind the curtain and see the man behind the collar sometimes. And it changed her whole attitude towards him. And it changed her whole approach to how she's going to respond to him in the future. So let's take the time to look behind the curtain. Let's take the time to, affirm people. Let's be slow in what we say to them sometimes. Let's learn, as Jesus learned, that what we say to people is important. We can hurt them or lift them up. We can harm them or make them whole. We can destroy them or heal them with the words we have. It's not what goes in, it's what comes out.